History is often written by the victors, but more specifically, it's written by the families who managed to keep their hands on the wheel for centuries. The impact left by these prominent ruling houses can far outlast their own bloodlines and the legacy of any single monarch. But if you had a choice, which great house would you actually want to belong to? Every dynasty had its perks. Think unfathomable wealth, glorious palaces, and absolute power, but those came balanced by massive responsibilities and some of the most brutal challenges of their respective eras. From the sand-swept monuments of Egypt's fourth dynasty to the tragic splendor of the Romanovs, we're going to dive deep into the pros and cons of being part of history's most influential ruling families. Let's start in the sprawling, frost-bitten landscape of Russia with the Romanovs. This family ruled for over 300 years, from 1613 all the way to 1917. If you were a Romanov, the pros were pretty significant. You oversaw a vast empire with an incredibly vibrant and distinctive culture. But the in-a-nutshell version of their story is one of stability followed by ultimate tragedy. The Romanovs rose to power at a moment when Russia desperately needed a win. They ended the 15-year time of troubles, a chaotic period filled with coups, royal pretenders, and civil wars that nearly destroyed the kingdom. When Michael took the throne in 1613, he finally brought peace. Then his grandson Peter the Great leveled things up. Peter was a force of nature who turned Russia into a massive European-style empire. He won major wars against Sweden, overhauled the entire political and educational system, and basically dragged the country into the future. By the time he died in 1725, Russia was one of the big players on the world stage. Later that century, Catherine the Great, another powerhouse, continued the trend. She expanded the empire's territory, won victories over the Ottomans, and was a massive patron of Russian literature and art. However, the 19th century wasn't his kind. By the time Nicholas II, the last Tsar, took over, the cracks were showing. A disastrous war with Japan in 1905 almost ended the regime early, and World War I was the final nail in the coffin. The Russian Revolution didn't just end the Romanov reign. It ended the lives of the entire ruling family. So while the power was immense, the exit strategy was non-existent. Now, let's head over to England to look at a family that didn't last as long, but certainly made a lot of noise: the Tudors. Active from 1485 to 1603, this house emerged from the bloody mess of the Wars of the Roses. If you were a Tudor, your pros included a front-row seat to the English Renaissance and a world filled with outstanding music and literature. The cons? Serious trouble carrying on the bloodline and some of the most dysfunctional marriages in human history. The Tudors might lack the longevity of other houses, but they had main character energy. Henry VII won the throne on the battlefield, ending decades of civil war. His son Henry VIII is the one everyone knows. In his 36 years of power, he changed England forever. He founded the Royal Navy, established the first post office, and most famously, broke away from the Catholic Church to form the Church of England, all because he needed a divorce. His daughter Elizabeth I later oversaw a golden age of exploration and art, but the stress of producing an heir was a constant shadow over the family, and eventually, the line simply ran out of people. If luxury is more your speed, you might want to look at the Ming Dynasty in China, which ruled from 1368 to 1644. During the early Ming period, there's a very strong argument that China was the single most powerful nation on earth. The pros here were top-tier, luxury trade goods, all the books you could ever want to read, and living in the world's most magnificent palace. The cons were the constant threat of enemies at the borders and internal strife that seemed to trigger every time there was a major flood. The Ming emperors lived in the Forbidden City in Beijing, a massive complex with nearly 10,000 rooms filled with priceless art. Only those with the emperor's direct permission could even enter. Under the third emperor, Ju Di, great treasure fleets sailed the world. Though later rulers realized they didn't really need to go looking for wealth, the world was coming to them. The Ming weren't just about gold, though. They were about infrastructure. They restored the Great Wall and created an economic base so strong that books became affordable for the common person, sparking a literary revolution. While the Ming were building walls, the Romans were refining the art of the good emperor. The Nerva-Antonine dynasty, 96 W6 CE, featured 5 of the most successful rulers in Roman history. The pros were simple. You were the master of Rome during its absolute peak. The cons? You had to deal with barbarians at the gates and the eventual arrival of Commodus, who basically ruined the whole vibe. What made this dynasty unique was that for a long time, succession happened by adoption rather than birth. The reigning emperor would pick the most capable man and adopt him as his heir. This gave Rome a run of leaders who actually knew what they were doing. Nerva was the wise elder. Trajan expanded the borders to their maximum. Hadrian consolidated those gains. Antoninus Pius stabilized the economy. And Marcus Aurelius was the famous philosopher king. It was an era of incredible stability until Marcus Aurelius broke the pattern and left the empire to his biological son Commodus, whose erratic behavior signaled the beginning of the end for Roman greatness. For a different kind of longevity, we have to look at ancient Egypt's fourth dynasty. This was the pinnacle of the Old Kingdom, roughly 2613 to 2494 BCE. The pro here is immortality. You'd leave behind the Great Pyramid of Giza. This was an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity where the Egyptian state was organized enough to build the most iconic monuments in human history. The fourth dynasty only lasted about 120 years, mostly because they kept the bloodline so pure through inbreeding that the family eventually hit a biological dead end. But in those 120 years, they changed the skyline of the planet forever. Moving into the medieval and early modern world, the Osmans, the ruling house of the Ottoman Empire, set the record for endurance, ruling from 1299 all the way to 1922. The pros were massive. You owned Constantinople, controlled world trade, and had access to the best science and the biggest cannons of the era. The cons were the succession laws. In the early days, it was a free-for-all. Any male relative could take the throne, which often led to internal wars. The empire peaked under Suleiman the Magnificent, who was an incredible military strategist and a brilliant legal reformer. He commissioned some of the world's most beautiful mosques and maintained an elite fighting force called the Janissaries. However, the 1800s saw the empire begin to decline. After World War I, the dynasty was finally toppled, and the royal house was exiled. Interestingly, the last surviving heir to the throne actually ended up as a librarian in New York City, living until 2017. In East Asia, the Joseon dynasty ruled Korea for 5 centuries, 1392–1897. They didn't focus on conquering the world. They focused on perfecting their own culture. The pros were a vibrant language, advanced science, and legendary naval technology like the turtle ships. The cons were their geography being stuck right between the competing powers of China and Japan. King Sejong the Great was the highlight of this family. He created Hangul, the Korean alphabet, specifically so that ordinary people could learn to read and write easily. It's one of the most intuitive writing systems ever designed. While elites at the time hated it, it brought literacy to the masses. The Joseon era was peaceful for a long time, earning Korea the nickname the Hermit Kingdom, because they preferred to stay isolated. Unfortunately, that isolation made them vulnerable when Japan and China's regional rivalry eventually boiled over, ending the dynasty in the late 19th century. At the same time, Japan was being ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate, 1603 to 1868. They rose out of the chaos of the Sengoku period, a century of constant civil war. Tokugawa Ieyasu won the Battle of Sekigahara and established a dynasty that would keep Japan at peace for 265 years. The pros were ruling during a golden age of art, kabuki theater, and woodblock printing. The cons were the strict social rules and the total ban on most foreign contact. The Tokugawa created a rigid social hierarchy where you couldn't move between classes. They essentially locked the country down, allowing only a tiny Dutch trading post at Dejima to remain open. It was a time of internal prosperity where merchants thrived and the samurai eventually put away their guns to focus on philosophy and swordcraft. This peaceful bubble only burst when American warships arrived in 1853, forcing Japan to modernize and bringing the shogunate to an end. Of course, we can't talk about ruling families without the Habsburgs. These guys had a wide collection of crowns but an incredibly narrow family tree, ruling for roughly 1020 to 1918. They held titles like Holy Roman Emperor and were the kings of Austria, Spain, Hungary, and even Mexico for a hot minute. The pros were obvious. You were basically the middleman of Europe. The cons? A very unfortunate jawline. The Habsburgs were terrified of their titles falling to rival families, so they married each other. A lot. This led to the famous Habsburg jaw, a physical deformity caused by generations of inbreeding. Charles V was the most famous of the bunch, ruling an empire on which the sun never set. They were a geopolitical powerhouse for centuries, but their biological strategy eventually caught up with them. In Scotland and England, the Stuarts, 1371 to 1714, had a much more chaotic run. The pros were mastering Great Britain during the age of exploration and trade. The nutshell version, though, is that they were incredibly unlucky. The early Scottish Stuart kings were murdered, died in sieges, or had nervous breakdowns. Mary, Queen of Scots, was famously executed by her cousin Elizabeth I. However, Mary's son James I eventually united the crowns of Scotland and England. The Stuarts oversaw a massive cultural shift and the colonization of the Americas, but they constantly clashed with Parliament. This led to the English Civil War and the eventual Glorious Revolution, where the family was pushed out of power. The last Stuart monarch, Queen Anne, had a tragic personal life, being pregnant 17 times but outliving all of her children, meaning the Stuart line ended with her. Finally, we have the Valois-Francs, 1284–1598. They are the family that won the 100 Years' War and sent the English packing. The pros were experiencing the French side of the Renaissance and living in the lap of luxury. The cons? Dealing with the Black Death and a series of bizarre accidents. One king died after hitting his head on a doorframe. Another died in a jousting accident. Their most colorful member was Francis I, known as Francis of the Big Nose. He was a true Renaissance man who loved art, women, and combat. He was a patron of Leonardo da Vinci and promoted the French language across the kingdom. But after him, the family fell into religious turmoil and internal bickering. The dynasty ended in 1598, when Henry III died without an heir, passing the torch to the Bourbons. Every one of these families left a mark that we still feel today. Whether it's the shape of a pyramid, the letters on a page, or the borders of a modern nation, belonging to them meant living a life of unimaginable privilege. But history shows us that the higher you sit, the harder the eventual fall. Which one would you choose? A short, brilliant life as a Tudor, or a long, stable reign like the Osmonds? Either way, you'd be trading your privacy for a permanent place in the history books.